Cool. All right. So onward to biology here. I think I want to start, get rid of that. Just talk about the exam from last time. I was pretty impressed because it was a difficult exam, for sure. And the average was a 76, I believe, or 75. And that's actually very high for a difficult exam as an average. Like I've said before, usually these exams, the standard department-wide is typically in the high 60s or mid to high 60s. So yeah, guess I'll have to go even tougher on you guys. Just kidding. Okay. But I think you'll find that the remainder of the semester is vastly different than what we've talked about, in the sense of we're becoming more grand in scale here. So we've dealt a lot at the cellular and molecular levels, cell biology, you know, a bit of biochemistry with metabolism and cell respiration. We've talked about molecular biology, DNA, all these things that are very small, very molecular mechanism, you know. But the rest of the semester is kind of fun to teach intro bio because we get to do it all. We get to really explore a little bit of every aspect of biology, which is awesome because biology covers so much more than just the cell. There's ecology and environmental biology. There's bioengineering, biotechnology. There's evolutionary biology. That's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to begin our evolutionary journey today as we talk about Unit 3. So that being said, are there any questions before we get started? Let's see, is there anything else? Oh, I usually give a little tiny speech of sorts before I dive into evolution, just that it stirs up controversy somehow with religion and the Bible versus scientists. But I say versus, I think it's sort of misplaced because I don't see a conflict in my eyes. I see two different arenas of thought that are both equally valid. Opinions, absolutely. And I think, you know, it's actually a really interesting time to be talking about evolution because of the election and everything. And, you know, how we're trying to unify people and come together, even if you have differing opinions, as Sana has stated. I think that's very important. And I don't see a conflict. I think that there are many scientists who I know are religious and go to church and believe in science. And then there are many religious people that believe in scientific practice. And, you know, it's all good. I think they're just different spheres of knowledge and experience. And so they don't really contradict one another in my eyes. But however, I do also like to mention that you don't have to believe anything I say. You don't have to trust or, you know, agree with anything I say. But I have a course outline of record, which is basically this outline of topics that I am required by Saddleback to talk about and test you on. So while you don't have to agree with this, you do have to know it. You do have to understand it and know it and reproduce it on the exam. That's just my job. Okay, but that's it. That's all I like to say. So Do we have class on Wednesday? I think so. It's not Thanksgiving yet. Oh, is it Veterans Day? Let me look at the syllabus really quick. Should have all holidays marked off on the syllabus. Says no class? No way. Oh, I guess we don't. It's Veterans Day on Wednesday. Wow. Some teachers? Well, it would be all teachers. It would have to be. No, veterans, Saddleback is, I'm just going to double check. Because I don't know why I'm going to double check. I just want to make sure I got that right, I guess. Let me see. So academic calendar 2020. Here we go. So this is official. I'm just looking online here. Wait, we're in November. Yeah, 11th. Class is not in session. No class. There's my announcement. Thank you for bringing that to my attention, because I would have forgot and I would have had to email everyone. So I'll probably forget myself. So I'm going to write it into my reminders, no class. So we're going to do the first part of evolution today. And then we're going to be finishing not on Wednesday, but next week. So I get to see you once this week as well. All right. So I'm just setting that in for myself. I know. I'll probably email you guys to remind you. And that's 11/11, right? November 11th. All right, sweet. Thank you. Okay, well, let's get started. We're going to be talking about evolution. I am screen sharing. Boom. All right. Evolution. Admit Tiffany here. Okay. Now, this lecture is a little different than I usually do. As I'm sure you've noticed by now, I use that a lot. I use the whiteboard a lot. I think it makes it more engaging and interactive. And I think it actually helps facilitate learning if you're drawing out these cells and structures and such, writing out definitions and putting it in your mind. But this lecture is kind of not so much about the structures and mechanisms. It's really picture based and a lot more text, and I tend to use the PowerPoint more. I do write one or two things, but just for your information, we're going to really be focusing on the slides this time, but I do write one very important sort of catchphrase of mine, if you will, on the whiteboard, which I will do, because it applies throughout the whole lecture, and so I kind of just keep it up there. So let me get my notes out. Boom, boom, boom. Markers, okay. Okay. So let's start by asking, what is evolution? What is evolution? Does anyone want to take a stab at it? What is evolution? Just without looking anything up, what do you think it is? What does it mean to evolve? Progression of life. I like that. How does life progress? How would you say life progresses? What's happening? Adapt, change. There we go. I love that. Change is definitely what I'm looking for. Beneficial mutations. Yes, you bet. Things are changing. Mutations are happening that are good and some bad. But this really this word change is the big important word here. So change in the heritable, meaning these are characteristics, traits, genes that encode for these traits, as we learned in the last unit, that can be passed from generation to generation. And it is this change in biological populations over time or successive generations. So I think, before we go to Darwin, I want to put this in your heads. and I get kind of fierce about it, because not that I'm upset, but sometimes, a lot of the time, students, I'll tell them this, but they'll still miss the question. But okay, evolution is a general change over time. Okay, evolution is a general change over time. I don't know why I wrote it like that, but I underline general. Okay. All too often, students will think of evolution and think of natural selection, which is the main focus of today's lecture. It's the primary force that drives evolution. But there are other forces at work that will drive evolution. We focus on those next class, so next week. But I want you to keep in mind that evolution is a general change over time that can occur. This change in these biological populations can occur by a variety of mechanisms. Natural selection, the focus of today's lecture, is just one of these mechanisms. So if I were to ask you on the exam, which I probably will, what is evolution? If I say, the blah, 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 natural selection, or whatever natural selection is that we're going to learn, you're going to know that's not the answer. It's one way populations evolve, but populations evolve other ways. And so the correct answer would be this general change over time that can be caused by a variety of different types of mechanisms of evolution. And we're going to talk about all of them. But like I said, today we're really going to focus on natural selection. So natural selection is this process that will cause this change over time. It's one process. It's really a famous, important one. And the guy who discovered it, his name is Mr. Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin. Let's take a look at Mr. Darwin here. Okay. Just reading my notes here. Okay. So Charles Darwin's story, I'm going to kind of begin it with the fact that, let's put it on me while I talk here. Well, first I'll start. This is a long time ago, 1800s, 19th century, okay? And Charles Darwin's this dude, and at that time, species, organisms were thought to be unchanged since their creation. They were they're just on the earth and they don't really change. This is how they always were. That was the thought at the time. And Charles Darwin, his backstory is he was always very interested in nature. He was always doing things outside. He was interested in activities like fishing, riding horses, and collecting insects, all these things outdoors. And his dad was a doctor, physician, and wanted him to go to medical school, but he was kind of over it. He was bored. He went to medical school in Edinburgh. He went to medical school and it bored him. It bore him. He found it boring, and he also found it horrifying a little bit because surgery didn't have anesthesia and the proper sterilization kind of techniques, and he was just not about it. And so he dropped out of medical school and went to Cambridge, I think, some other university. And he was trying to figure out what he wanted to do. And so there was this offer to go on a voyage with another professor at the university who was charting unknown regions in South America, regions that Europe wasn't familiar with. And so they were going to go chart these regions. And so he went on it. It's like a year-long thing. And they went a lot of places. Darwin and this guy charting these and mapping out these places. But in addition to that, Darwin spent days and days on shore collecting and observing life, plants and animals that were in these vastly different environments that he was exposed to. And he made some incredible observations, many of which were published in his first book on the origin of species, in 1859. And yes, he is the pioneering champion of natural selection. This is this fundamental theory of evolution, which we're going to be discussing. Okay. Okay, so this is the HMS Beagle is the name of the ship. So they started off in Europe and they went a lot of places, mostly in South America, but the Galapagos Islands, home to one of his famous landmark studies that we'll discuss, bit around Australia, et cetera, et cetera. And so really what Darwin was exposed to were different environments, vastly different environments, jungles, grasslands, mountains. This is all, Argentina, the Andes Mountains here. You can see jungles in Brazil. These are very different climates, very different animals and plants living there. And if you look at my bullet points, so these changes, these environments, different environments, he observed how it impacts nature and how these changes, more specifically about nature, drives the changes in characteristics over time. We're going to dive deeper into that, but really my main point here is Darwin, his sort of really key sort of observation about these vastly different environments were how these plants and animals had these different characteristics, physical characteristics about them that made them well suited to each environment. That was the key. He would see these creatures, these organisms, and say, these look so vastly different, and they look well adapted to their specific environments, whether it's camouflage or big ears, or if you're in a cold environment, you have a thick coat of fur, whatever it is. That's something he was noticing, this ability to survive depending on the environment. And we're going to explore how species over time change depending on if they're able to survive. That was natural selection. That was Darwin's sort of hallmark discovery. And so let's take a look at that. First, are there any questions so far about Darwin and his epic journey? Sir Charles Darwin. He'll be on the exam. Yeah. I mean, like what he did? Maybe. Yeah, I would know it. I'm not going to have like 20 questions about Darwin's life. This isn't a history class. It's more interest. But I would certainly be towards the end of that little speech there, just kind of his main observations. It's good to know for sure. But like dates and stuff and where he went, then no, you're good. Save that for the historians. Oh, this is from a museum. Some of the shells he collected. Cool. Cool. I would like to go to that museum someday. Okay. So here I have, which is very rare for me, as you know, a paragraph of sorts, a couple sentences of what is natural selection from Charles Darwin's words himself. And I'm just going to read it to you because I thought it was, as I define natural selection, or as I was going to, I couldn't do it as good as he does. I can't. And I thought it was so great, I just kind of just put it in the slide. And it's a little, fancy sounding, but it's eloquent. I like it. And we're going to dissect it, of course. So as many more individuals of each species are born than can possibly survive, and as consequently there is a frequently recurring struggle for existence, it follows that any being, if it vary however slightly, in any manner profitable to itself, under the complex and sometimes varying conditions of life, will have a better chance of surviving and thus be naturally selected. I mean, that's just beautifully put. So how could I not include that? And what he means by all this fancy language is that there is this struggle for existence that plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, all life has to compete with one another, has to avoid death, has to find food to survive. And if there are any in this population of bacteria or human beings or whatever it is that have an advantage over the others, they're going to survive. The others will die. And that population might change over time because that person will reproduce and pass on, as we've talked about in genetics, the traits that allowed that person to survive, these beneficial adaptations. So in a population, when you have organisms that are varied and different, which they are, we've actually talked about the mechanisms of how that comes about in meiosis, and we've talked a bit about mutation, but we'll talk more about it. When you have these differing individuals, some have a better chance of surviving, and they are thus naturally selected for. They survive, and they are therefore able to pass on their genes to the next generation. And so you see this change this adaptation's occurring. These other ones die out that don't have these traits that allowed them to survive. So we're gonna talk a lot about this today. But yeah, so that's from Charles Darwin's words. And for the next sort of concept, this is the catchphrase I'm referring to that I write on the board, that I sort of one of my bumper sticker phrases that I love. And sort of alluded to this fact with these differing environments and different adaptations specific to each environment. I want you to keep this phrase in mind. Environment dictates phenotype. Okay, now what do I mean by this key catchphrase of mine? I think the next slide and example will assist in that. So let's take a look. So, okay, natural selection. Okay, now if you take a look here, I mentioned that, as Darwin said, if any individuals, quote, vary in a manner profitable to itself, or in other words, are more likely to survive based on a certain characteristic that they have, they will survive. That's right. And then when they do, they are more likely, so the individuals with these advantageous traits are more likely to survive, reproduce, and pass these traits on. And I'm going to show you a classic example that I love, to the right here, of this idea. Okay. So there's this canyon, right? There's my mouse. And it's sort of dark colored, right? This canyon. And you have dark colored mice with darker fur color. Then you have mice with this tan color, this lighter tan beige color, right? And in this canyon, and wherever this is located, and where would a dark canyon be? Darker rock. Maybe it's like near a volcano. Who knows? But in this environment, very specific environment, the hawk, the predator, can easily spot the mice that are tan, right? While the darker colored mice blend in really well and they evade the hawk, right? Well, some mice get eaten, and as you can see, a larger amount of the tan mice get eaten because they're very visible. And after that, over time, right, evolution, natural selection, these processes don't really happen overnight. In fact, they really take millions of years for this type of change to occur. But essentially, in this example, the mice that, the ones that survive more, the ones that blend in with the canyon, are able to reproduce, and they pass these traits on the dark fur color, and therefore you get over time this population of mice has now changed over time. It has adapted to its environment. And so there's less visible mice. That's my favorite example. Really paints a clear picture here that the organisms that have a better chance of surviving in this varied population will survive past reproductive age and are therefore able, they didn't die, so they can reproduce, and they pass that on. And so now there's just more of them, more that are adapted to the environment. Now, back to my sort of key phrase. Get some water here. Come on. Can't find my, that's okay. Oh, no, I got it. Okay. Back to my key phrase, right? Environment dictates phenotype. So I'm gonna change the scenario here. What if instead we have the same mice population, but instead they live in, my parents just got back from Sedona, and the canyons there, well, they're red-ish, it's cool looking, but let's just say somewhere with tan canyons, beige, lighter colored canyon. So that, a good example could be Southern California, right? So we put this same mice, we move them from that volcanic area to the Southern California canyon, and it's lighter colored. Well, we're not going to see the same result, are we? Now, the darker colored mice would be visible to the hawk, and we're going to see less darker colored mice over time because they're getting eaten. And because the tan colored mice are surviving, they're able to reproduce and pass on the tan colored gene, tan colored trait, and you're going to see more tan colored blended in mice. So what's my point here? The environment calls the shots. I changed the environment. I changed the color of the canyon, depending on where on the earth these mice are. The environment dictates. It plays the role of, I get to choose who lives and who dies. The phenotype, the change over time, the characteristics that we see over time are dictated by the color of the canyon. At the end of the day, when the canyon was darker colored, we saw more darker colored mice. That's phenotype. And then in contrast, I changed that. And over time, the phenotype, the change over time was toward the lighter colored mice in that canyon. So the environment plays this massive role in what your population is going to look and act like. And by environment, I don't just mean where they live. I mean the types of predators. I mean the types of diseases present. I mean the food availability. But predator-prey relationships are a huge one for sure. And the trait that was naturally selected for here is camouflage. It's all about surviving in this world and in natural selection. Okay. So let's take a look. Does that make sense to all of you? Does anyone? So the environment is key here. And that's what Darwin was noticing in the mountains, in the jungles. Very different environments, different organisms, different traits. Gotta survive in these crazy environments. Okay, so as I mentioned, just some examples of selective pressures in this dark, cruel, Darwinian survival world of ours. Uh, Predation exists, disease by bacteria and viruses, competition with other organisms for food and space, being safe and being having a place to be and not in the open. Mate choice. So this we're going to talk a lot more about next time. It's just another mechanism of selection, but essentially, female mate choice depends on male characteristics, but we're going to talk about that more next time. But just keep in the back of your mind. Physical conditions are selective, temperature, salinity. So organisms that are well adapted to these types of things are going to survive. And they're going to have characteristics that allow them to do so, as we've seen with the mice. Okay. The famous example, Darwin's sort of claim to fame. Okay. So Darwin's claim to fame is the Galapagos finches. Anyone heard about the Galapagos finches? And it's sort of another great example to depict kind of this natural selection process. And essentially, the different finches have different beaks and behaviors that allowed them to adapt to their specific environments on their home islands. So this is the Galapagos. See here? So these are finches on different islands, and Darwin was bored and noting the differences in their beaks. So there's a cactus-eating finch, insect, and seed-eating finch. So if you look at the cactus one, A, has a long, sharp beak, helps it get into the cactus and eat it, the flowers and pulp, and get the nutrients. So it needs that long, sharp beak. And these cacti are on that island that he's native to, right? So again, environment's dictating what this guy looked like, phenotype. The green warbler finch, B over here, he has a narrow pointed beak because there's a lot of insects on his island. So the insects on his island are going to kind of, well, we'll see how this happens in a video soon. But warbler finches that have these beaks these long, narrow beaks are going to be more successful because they can spear the insects easier with precision. And then the large ground finch has a large beak. So this one, I remember this island had a long period of drought, so there's a lot of seeds on the ground. And these large beaks were able to crack open the seeds and get the nutrients inside. So again, these different environments are really shaping what these organisms look like. And that's what Darwin was interested in and noting. Video. I'm sure you're sick of videos by now, but this one's great. It kind of paints the picture really well. And it's not long. So let's take a look here. Where's my chicken and broccoli recipe? No. Might be making that tonight. Sharing is paused. Oops. Okay, hold on. Okay, let's check it out.
The primary way that evolution occurs is through the action of natural selection. That is, populations change in response to environmental pressures, and they become adapted to new conditions, and they change over time.
Following Charles Darwin's lead, biologist Chris Schneider and his colleagues traveled to Ecuador to study the evolution of several animal species. This lush rainforest is a natural laboratory for ongoing investigation of evolutionary theory. Natural selection is at the core of their research on hummingbirds.
In our research, we're trying to understand how new species arise. This is Darwin's fundamental question. On the origin of species, how do new species arise? And what we're finding is that natural selection seems to be an incredibly important factor in generating new species.
Natural selection, the key evolutionary mechanism Darwin identified, is really four processes: genetic variation, overproduction of offspring, struggle for existence, and differential survival and reproduction. First, genetic variation. Individuals within a species vary from one to the other. For evolution to work by natural selection, the characteristics that give an individual an advantage in a certain environment have to be passed on from one generation to the next.
And in hummingbirds, bill length seems to have a very strong genetic basis. That is, if two parents mate and both of those parents have long bills, their offspring will have long bills. If those parents have shorter bills, their offspring will have shorter bills.
Second, there is overproduction of offspring.
Darwin realized that natural selection would operate because individuals in natural populations tend to produce more offspring than can survive. For example, hummingbirds over their lifetime will often produce dozens of offspring, but only one or two of those individuals are likely to survive.
The third factor in natural selection is the struggle for existence, and that leads to differential survival and reproduction.
In any population, whether it's plants or animals or whatever, this excess production of individuals results in what Darwin called the struggle for existence. And what he had in mind there, I think, was the competition for food and space and mates as well. Hummingbirds compete for nectar. They often compete very fiercely for limited resources. Natural selection will favor individuals that are more efficient at getting nectar. And natural selection will result in changes in wing shape that allow hummingbirds to fly longer distances, for instance, or maybe to be more maneuverable, to maneuver around flowers and get nectar more efficiently. And probably most importantly, it'll affect the length and shape of the bill.
Bill measurements. In the case of hummingbirds, we know that a 1 or 2 millimeter change in length can have profound differences on how efficiently that bird feeds and how well it survives.
Individual survivors are more likely to reproduce and pass on their advantageous as well as other genes to their offspring. In an environment with long flowers, having a long bill is an advantageous trait. Not necessarily the absolute best trait always, just a better one in this environment. Hummingbirds with small bills may not survive, and eventually there will only be hummingbirds with long bills. Over a long period of time, the entire population of hummingbirds adapts to the shape and size of the flowers that exist in that environment. Adaptations that benefit them in their lifetimes. Just as you cannot make your arm longer to reach a book on a shelf up high, individual small-billed hummingbirds that move into an area where there are longer flowers can't make their bills longer. Their bill length is determined by the DNA they inherited from their parents.
Okay. Alrighty, so I like that video. I think it's pretty good, very clear, makes it very clear. So I want to first say that we look at a population, right? And there's variation. There's genetic variation in the population. And some of these individuals, like the hummingbirds, had longer beaks and some had shorter. So there's variation. but they haven't really discussed yet how we get that variation in populations. And we're going to talk about that. That's the key here. How do these like favorable, beneficial, advantageous genes, like a longer humming or a longer beak, arise? And it did mention the hummingbird can't just make it get bigger in its lifetime and then be better at obtaining the nectar from the flowers. But we're going to take a look at how this happens, how these differences arise. And it happens really through mutation, genetic mutations. Oh, these are the criteria they mentioned. I'll give you a sec if you want to copy that down. It's in the slides, so I'll give you like 5 seconds. Gosh. Yeah. Sec plural. But yes, these are all necessary for natural selection to occur. Oh, it's my mutation. Oh, screw that up. Okay, never mind. Mutation we'll talk about soon. But let's we got to cover this point about how the example it said you can't make your arm longer, right? If you want to reach a book or a banana or whatever it is in your environment, it comes in the DNA from your parents that mentioned. That is true, but I really want to tackle how new traits arise. How does an individual get a longer arm? Now, Lamarck was another evolutionary biologist who thought that you could get a longer arm during your lifetime, or a longer beak if you're a hummingbird. And he thought that this was possible if, well, his famous example is the giraffe here that needs to reach fruits in the tree and it can't reach it, so it would stretch its neck. And so it's stretching its neck, it's trying to get the fruit, and over that giraffe's lifetime, its neck gets longer, its muscles get bigger, and it's able to get the fruit. And then it'll pass that on, and its offspring now have long necks because of genes. That's not how it works. This is false. Wait for it. False. Lamarck was not correct. Big no-no. Darwin was correct. And so we'll take a look at the misconception in a moment. But if you're stretching your neck as a giraffe and you get these longer muscles or whatever, that you do not pass that on to your trait or to your offspring. The sort of analogy here is kind of like if someone loses their arm in a terrible accident, their child actually is not born with one arm. So these things that happen over our lifetime are not passed on. Our DNA is. Things that encode the traits we're born with. And so these new characteristics that come about throughout an individual's lifetime, or even another good example is if you go to the gym and become a bodybuilder, you suddenly decide to do that, your child will not be born with giant muscles or this physique, right? These are changes in your life. The thing that's passed on is DNA. It's the genetic material, and you'd have to change that in order to change your offspring. And you do that with mutation. We learned that mutation is, by definition, change in the DNA. So we're going to look at that next. First, let's kind of talk about this misconception here. So what is incorrect about the statement, organisms develop new traits or adaptations to help them survive? just type in the chat what you think was incorrect about that. Anyone? It's okay. It's a long, you might be still typing, but essentially, this is what's going on. Oh, did someone type something? Develop new traits. Let's talk about it. Okay. Now, this is implying, right? If I go back, this is implying that what Lamarck is saying, that the giraffe will develop a longer neck to help it survive in its environment where it needs to reach these tall trees. But what actually happens is these organisms are actually already born with longer necks, not the ones that stretch their necks, but others will be born with longer necks. Others will be born with shorter necks. Populations come into being already with these traits, this variation, if you will, okay? They come into existence. Yes, you can't change your genes after you're born, correct? And when you're born, that's really in the initial stages is when you get these new traits, and they happen randomly by mutation, okay? So essentially, you get a population of giraffes, for instance, that is already randomly different characteristic wise. You have some with short necks, some with long. That all came about by genetic mutation, which we're going to talk about on the next slide. This varied population of giraffes is then selected on by the environment. And the ones with longer necks or the beneficial traits will survive because the trees in that environment are tall. But the variations themselves didn't come about during their lifetime. The only way they come about is at the DNA level. The DNA level. Okay. So mutations are this primary driving force. Mutations are the way that new traits can come about, which is why they can sometimes be harmful, as you learned in the lab, and sometimes they can be beneficial. But as we learned, they are changes that occur during the copying of DNA in cells, and they can produce new alleles, leading to new traits. Genetic variation, of course, we learned during meiosis that crossing over, independent assortment, these types of processes are going to generate diversity in a population as well. But when it comes to these novel, brand new, traits coming out of nowhere, mutations are the primary mechanism. So I'll just leave that up for a moment. Okay. Let's see. So what was I going to say? Okay, so like I said, sort of a recap here. In this population of giraffes or hummingbirds, all of these variations occur at that DNA level when they're born, by mutation mainly, a bit with meiosis since diversity in the gametes. And so as this population gets older and grows up into adult hummingbirds, adult giraffes, you see variation already randomly. There's no will involved. There's no during your lifetime lifting weights and changing. No, it's all at that very beginning due to mutation in the DNA. Then with your hodgepodge of differing organisms in your population, the environmental selective pressures then act upon that variation and selects for the ones that vary in that manner profitable to that organism, as Darwin said, or the one that survival. You've probably heard the phrase survival of the fittest. And I think I kind of skipped over what we mean by evolutionary fitness, but evolutionary fitness, back here, so fitness, we consider an organism to be fit or have a high fitness level if it has a high level or high chance of surviving. So the hummingbird with long beaks has a high chance of surviving, has a high fitness, and then the giraffes with longer necks would have higher fitness as well. And so they are selected for by their environment, right? The environment dictates who lives and who dies, survival of the fittest. And they are therefore able to pass on their genes, etc. Okay, so we talked about this discussion question sort of during meiosis very briefly, but since we're talking about evolution, I want you to take a look at this question, think about it for a minute. And so why is this good? Why do we want genetic variation in a population of organisms? To prevent genetic bottlenecks. Yeah. So a bottleneck, I mean, yes. So why don't we want a bottleneck? Why do we want diversity? Why would we want diversity? Why don't we want everyone to be the same? Environment is constantly changing. Oh, I didn't even think of that. Yeah. I agree with that. Environment's constantly changing, causing me to think. I love it. Yes, absolutely. Let's say the population's identical and everyone's really good at surviving in this identical population. But then all of a sudden the environment changes, which it does. See climate change, for instance, the earth getting warmer or whatever it is, or a new predator comes into the population, whatever it is. That population that was so good at surviving is now susceptible because they're all the same. So that's a great example. So variation helps the population survive. Yes, and I'll tell you why. So we touched upon it briefly when I mentioned the potato famine in Ireland. Just let me, oops. Okay. Now, okay. Now, this is exactly what its cell is saying. It increases the likelihood of having organisms in that environment that are best suited for survival. If everyone's the same, everyone's vulnerable or everyone's strong. But just like Faith said, the environment changes and then everyone's weak. So you want some diversity. You want a mixture. So if you imagine the mice example and the hawk, and all the mice in this darkly colored canyon are tan. Well, the hawk's going to have a buffet, just be able to pick mice left and right. No one can hide. And so that mouse goes extinct. Bad. It's bad. You wanted some of the darkly colored mice to survive. And then they would pass on those genes. And then when the hawk comes back, oh my gosh, I can't find any mice. It's because they're all blended in. They've evolved against their predator. Right? And then, so that's kind of the main reason. Potato famine, of course, that example was when potato crops of the same species and strain, these potatoes were planted across Ireland, and a fungus was just able to completely decimate all of these plants and kill them. And they were identical. These were genetically identical plants that they planted across Ireland. And so they were all vulnerable to this fungus pathogen. And interestingly enough, we're going to look at some more examples. I like to focus this whole lecture on natural selection because it's so important. We're going to look at a couple more examples of natural selection. We've been talking a lot about kind of fake scenario ones, the mice, the giraffe, whatever. But we're going to look at some real world examples and how powerful it is. And essentially, this idea can work against us. For instance, antibiotic resistance. Antibiotic resistance is when bacteria, we're going to look at this, but bacteria that are not all the same have a better chance of surviving against antibiotics. Antibiotics kill bacteria. If all bacterial species were the same in this population in an infected person, that antibiotic would just clear them all out. But because there's some diversity, the antibiotic clears out most of them, but then some can survive and reproduce. And so that population lives on. So that's the main idea. Let's take a look at some cool examples. First, are there any other questions before I continue on? With some real world examples. I believe I have, I only have two. Well, they're two really good ones. I thought I had more. Oh, well, I had the finches. The finches are pretty good. Okay. So this one is pretty amazing and really illustrates this idea of environment dictating the phenotype pretty well. So, okay. So sickle cell anemia is a devastating disease that certain people have. They have a genetic mutation, and what it does is their red blood cells that circulate in their arteries and veins, well, the ones with the disease, their blood cells are sickled. They have this shape to them that's curved, and it can't store hemoglobin properly and bind oxygen, and they can aggregate and cause blockage in arteries. So it's no good. It's no good. It can kill people. So it's a devastating, horrible disease. As opposed to normal red blood cells without sickle cell anemia, they look like this. They look like these little donuts, sort of, that can carry hemoglobin and oxygen around the body without clotting or any nasty complications. Now, interestingly enough, there's, I don't know if any of you wrote your journal on malaria, but malaria is this disease caused by a very tiny protozoan parasite. And this parasite is able to infect healthy people without sickle cell anemia by entering their red blood cells. And that's how the disease progresses, and that's the life cycle of this parasite, and you get malaria. But if you have sickle cell anemia, they can't enter your blood cell because your blood cell is already screwed up. It's already sickled and it can't get in. So you actually have resistance against malaria if you have sickle cell anemia. And believe it or not, in areas of Africa where malaria is more deadly to than sickle cell anemia, sickle cell anemia is actually selected for. It is preferred. It is more advantageous than being healthy. And I'll show you exactly on the map. Check it out. So in Africa here, falciparum, that's the parasite that is common in these areas, right, of Africa, pretty much exactly correlates here between those with sickle cell anemia and nowhere else. Sickle cell would be selected against in other areas without malaria. But this is really, illustrating well this idea of the environment calling the shots again, and sort of determining who lives and who dies based on your characteristics. It determines the phenotype. So where you live, because of that environment where the malaria parasite is, determines if you have sickle cell or not. It's pretty similar geographically. It's pretty amazing. Okay, antibiotic resistance. So I mentioned this. This is a really good example of natural selection. So essentially how it works is you have bacteria in the body and antibiotics kill the bacteria, right? But the ones that are resistant survive. They are then able to multiply. Just ignore this last step. Yeah, they can transfer it, but don't worry about that. But they pass it on to their offspring through mitosis. They have that gene. They do that cell division, and they pass on the resistance gene. And then pretty soon, you apply the antibiotic again to the individual, and it doesn't work. And then you're screwed. It's not good. They've evolved against the environment of this with this antibiotic in it. Crazy. It's a very powerful idea from Darwin. Let me see here. Well, I think this was my last slide. So are we ahead of things here? Yeah, yeah. So let's just end with this last misconception here. Focus next time on other things, other mechanisms that drive evolution. Let's back up. Okay. Evolution misconception number 2. So what's incorrect about this statement? Natural selection results in the achievement of a particular goal, such as preventing malaria. It's a bit subtle, but take a look and what do you think? Artificial, yeah, I agree, Joey. We're going to talk about artificial next time. But let me see, doesn't it happen at random? Yes, absolutely. That's exactly right. It's not goal-oriented. It is random. Preventing malaria, these people did not get sickle cell willingly. It was totally random. It just happened to be useful in that environment. It's not a goal-oriented process. Okay, awesome. So yeah, next time I think we'll talk about artificial selection. I think it's a good place to stop. I like to really devote this majority of the lecture here to natural selection. I don't like ending early though. Although, anyways, yeah, does anyone have any questions? I mean, let me see. Might be able to start artificial selection. I think it's better to just leave it for next time. It's already 6:45. So no questions? Really? Nothing? All right. Yeah, why not? Gotta, whatever, just let them out early once in a while. Who knows, right? Do we know enough to do the lab? Yeah, as far as it's on natural selection. So yes, but I will be sending out the usual videos and whatnot. But as far as concepts go, we've definitely covered the basic principle. Yeah, so with that, that's it. So just email me if anything comes up, and yeah, no class on Wednesday. So we'll pick up evolution part 2 next week on Monday, and I'll be sending out lab materials tonight, shortly. So thank you guys, and have a good weekend in a week from now. So I'll see you. Have a good Veterans Day. All righty. Cool.